Welcome to the Reform Thinking Podcast. Try to look directly at your own eye right now.
Well, unless you have a mirror right in front of your face. I mean, that is physically impossible.
Right. Your eye was specifically engineered to see every single object in the room except for itself. And today, we are doing a deep dive into two very dense theological essays that argue true, saving faith operates in that precise same way.
Yeah, the core premise here is that biblical faith is completely blind to itself. It is designed to look outward.
And the moment it turns inward to examine itself, spiritual paralysis sets in. So the sources we are working through are titled Beholding Christ, Faith as the Soul's Steadfast Gaze, and the Unself-Regarding Eye.
Both are fantastic texts.
They really are. Our mission in this deep dive is to unpack how the biblical authors define faith, not as some mystical inward feeling you have to constantly measure, but as a resolute outward gaze fixed entirely upon Jesus Christ.
Right, getting away from that constant self-measurement.
Exactly. We are going to look into how this ancient framework speaks directly to modern anxieties and the relentless distractions we face right now. So, okay, let's unpack this. There is a massive amount of material in these essays. Where do we even begin to break down the sheer mechanics of how faith actually functions?
We should probably begin right where the texts begin, which is with a concept drawn from A.W. Tozer's classic work, The Pursuit of God.
Oh yeah, the chapter called The Gaze of the Soul.
Yes, the sources highlight that specific chapter. Tozer makes an observation that frames the entire theological structure we're going to discuss today. He defines faith as the least self-regarding of all virtues.
The least self-regarding. What does that actually mean in practice?
Well, what Tozer means, and what these essays analyze in such rigorous detail, is the mechanical nature of faith itself. Think about how a physical eye operates in reality.
Okay.
A healthy physical eye perceives every single object placed in front of it. It sees the trees outside, the sky, the people sitting across from you. But the one thing a healthy eye never sees is itself.
Right. It is completely unconscious of its own existence.
Yeah, and if you are seeing your own eye, like if you are seeing floaters crossing your vision or the blur of a cataract, it means something is functionally wrong with your vision. The eye is not operating as designed.
I hear what you were saying about the eye, and the analogy makes sense on a physical level. The eye is designed to look out, not in. But I want to push back right out of the gate here.
Sure, go for it.
My immediate thought is about the biblical command to examine yourselves to see whether you are in the faith. We are told to test ourselves, right?
Oh, you are, yeah.
So if our culture is obsessed with looking inward to find an inner spark, how jarring is the biblical command to look entirely away from ourselves? How do we reconcile looking outwardly at Christ with the command to examine our own hearts? Are those two things contradictory?
That is a crucial distinction to make early on. The authors of these texts address this tension directly. They point out that introspection has a legitimate, limited place. Diagnostic self-examination is biblical, as you just mentioned.
Right, you check to see if there's spiritual fruit or maybe some hidden rebellion.
Absolutely. But there is a massive difference between a diagnostic check and an obsession. Diagnostic self-examination is meant to be a quick glance to reveal your own bankruptcy. And that quick glance should immediately force your eyes back outward to the Savior.
Ah, I see. So the problem is when it becomes the main focus.
Yeah, the problem, according to the text, is when self-examination mutates into self-fixation. By its very structural design, biblical faith is completely unconscious of itself as a grounds for assurance. True biblical faith looks out, it looks up, and it looks away from subjective human states.
It looks away from the self.
Right. The texts note that this aligns with the historical conviction that faith is not some meritorious action performed by human free will. It is a sovereignly bestowed instrument of vision. It is the tool the spiritually bankrupt sinner uses to behold the riches of Christ.
So when a person looks inward to find assurance, they are looking at the instrument of vision rather than the object they're supposed to be viewing.
Yes. You are staring at your own glasses instead of looking through them at the landscape.
That is such a helpful way to phrase it. It is the difference between a mirror and a window. I am thinking about how we approach spirituality today,
How do you mean?
Well, modern therapeutic spirituality functions almost entirely like a mirror. You are constantly told to look at your reflection, cultivate your image, find your inner truth. But the scriptural model of faith described here is a window.
Yeah, you are meant to look through it, out at something else entirely.
Right. And if you treat a window like a mirror, you are just going to end up staring at your own breath, fogging up the glass, completely missing the massive landscape outside. The modern world says, look within. But the biblical command, as quoted in the text from Isaiah, is, "Look unto me, and be ye saved, all the ends of the earth."
That is a stark contrast.
So what happens psychologically to a person who is constantly staring at their own fog in the glass?
The psychological toll is devastating. The essays discuss how agonizing it is for people to constantly search for faith within their own subjective feelings. It leads to complete spiritual paralysis.
Spiritual paralysis.
Yeah.
Because you are constantly taking your own spiritual temperature.
Yeah, analyzing your own sorrow, measuring the intensity of your own belief. They get trapped in this subjective loop. They sit there asking, is my faith strong enough today? Did I repent hard enough? Was I sincere enough?
Oh, wow. I know so many people stuck in that exact loop.
It is so common. They are demanding that their own flawed heart produce the peace that can only come from the finished work of Christ. You cannot find assurance by staring into a dark room. The result is chronic anxiety.
Right, because the modern approach conditions people to think that the intensity of their faith is what saves them, rather than the object of their faith.
Absolutely. That brings a specific quote from the source text into sharp focus. The authors provide a line from the 19th century Scottish pastor Robert Murray McCheyne.
Oh, I love McCheyne. What was the quote?
It hits incredibly hard when you understand this dynamic of the mirror versus the window. He said, for every look at yourself, take 10 looks at Christ.
For every look at yourself, take 10 looks at Christ. That is brilliant.
Yeah.
It sounds like he was dealing with people in his own congregation who were paralyzed by this exact inward obsession.
He absolutely was. That single sentence is the pastoral remedy for the anxiety we are talking about. When you stare into yourself, you see shifting shadows, fluctuating emotions, and mixed motives.
Which is terrifying, honestly.
It is. But when you look to Christ, you are looking into unchangeable light. The authors highlight that the object of faith is what provides stability, not the act of faith itself.
You know, this inward versus outward struggle, this temptation to look at the wrong thing, isn't a modern invention at all. We might think our therapeutic culture invented this anxiety, but the texts point out that this was the exact crisis facing the original audience of the book of Hebrews.
Yeah, the book of Hebrews is the perfect case study for this.
Right. And to understand why this outward gaze is so crucial, we have to grasp the historical crucible those first-century Christians were living in. I want to spend some time here because the historical context changes how we read the whole letter.
The historical background of the Epistle to the Hebrews is vital. The sources spend a significant amount of time establishing this context because it drives the entire theological argument of the letter.
Okay, set the scene for us. When was this written?
This epistle was written prior to the destruction of Jerusalem's temple in 70 A.D.
How do we know that for sure?
We know this based on internal evidence. The author continuously uses the present tense when describing the Levitical sacrifices. The massive stone temple was still standing. The Levitical priests were still actively offering animal sacrifices on the bronze altar.
So the whole Jewish religious system was fully operational and thriving while they were reading this?
Exactly. The original audience is reading this letter while the incense is literally still burning in Jerusalem.
Wow. So who were these people and what kind of pressure were they under?
The audience consisted of Hellenistic Jewish Christians, likely living in Rome or somewhere in Italy. They had made a public profession of faith in Jesus as the Messiah, but now they were facing severe, life-altering persecution.
We're talking about Neronian Rome, right?
Yes, Neronian Rome. The socio-political climate was hostile and highly volatile. For a Jewish person in the first century, converting to Christianity meant facing immediate social excommunication from the local synagogue.
Which was everything back then.
It was everything. The synagogue was the center of social, economic, and religious life. Being thrown out meant losing your business contacts, your family support, and your community standing.
That is a massive cost.
Furthermore, the texts indicate they were suffering the public confiscation of their earthly property. They were isolated, financially ruined, marginalized, and under intense psychological pressure to recant.
I get that the pressure was high, but I want to put myself in their shoes for a second. If I am suffering, if the government is seizing my property and my family has disowned me, I want something tangible to hold on to.
Right. It is human nature.
The temptation for them, according to the text, was to abandon this invisible Christ they had trusted in and return to the highly visible, sensory-rich environment of Old Covenant Judaism. So how does the author of Hebrews convince a starving, persecuted family that an invisible, crucified man is better than a massive stone temple with political protection?
That is the central pastoral challenge of the entire letter. The author has to break their infatuation with the physical shadows of the Old Covenant. You have to try and conceptualize the massive sensory pull of the ancient temple in Jerusalem, even for Jews living in the diaspora.
It must have been incredible to witness.
It was an architectural and sensory masterpiece. You had the massive stone structures, the intricate golden vessels, the continuous smell of the ascending smoke from the daily sacrifices.
Chanting choirs, right?
Yes, the choirs, the white-robed priests moving in absolute precision. It was highly visible, it was ancient and venerable. And crucially, it was a recognized legal religion in the Roman Empire, which provided a profound sense of political protection and social belonging.
And contrast that sensory overload with what the early Christians actually had. They did not have cathedrals.
Not at all. The early Christians were meeting in hidden, dark upper rooms, or perhaps in the homes of a few wealthy members. They had no political status. They had no ornate altars, no ascending incense, no formal priesthood in elaborate garments.
Just a small, despised group.
Yeah, and most difficult of all, their leader had died a highly public, shameful death as a state criminal on a Roman cross outside the city gates. The visible contrast between the two paths was staggering.
So to the physical eye, Judaism looked stable, glorious, and safe.
And Christianity looked weak, foolish, and incredibly dangerous. The temptation for these exhausted believers to shrink back to the visible, tangible shadows of the old system was immense.
If we pull that forward, we can connect this first-century sensory pull to our own modern distractions. The underlying human reflex hasn't changed at all.
Not one bit.
We also crave visible, tangible success metrics in our spiritual lives. We want to see large crowds, impressive buildings, measurable data, and cultural influence. Trusting in invisible realities is incredibly difficult for us today.
Oh, absolutely.
We want something we can touch and measure, something that validates our choices in front of the world.
That is a highly accurate parallel. The original audience felt that visible religious antiquity was safer than invisible dependence on an exalted, unseen Christ. They wanted a religion they could see with their physical eyes.
So how does the author counter that?
Well, to teach these suffering Christians how to trust an invisible reality, the author of Hebrews does something brilliant. He does not invent a new concept of faith. Instead, he reaches back into their own covenantal history, back into the Old Testament scriptures they revered.
He uses their own texts to prove the point.
Yes, to show them that God has always required this kind of outward expectant faith. He points them to a very strange, very specific moment in the wilderness to explain how salvation actually works.
Okay, this brings us to the Old Testament narrative of Numbers chapter 21 and its New Testament application by Jesus in John chapter 3. This is the story of the bronze serpent.
A fascinating account.
Let me set the scene based on the details provided in the text. The Israelites are in the wilderness. They are nearing the end of their 40 years of wandering. They are deeply discouraged, and as they often do, they rebel.
As is their pattern.
Right. They speak against God and against Moses. They call the miraculous provision of manna worthless bread. In response to this rebellion, God sends fiery, venomous serpents into the camp. People are being bitten, the venom is taking effect, and people are dying in agony.
It is a horrific scene.
Total chaos. The Israelites cry out to Moses for help. But the remedy God provides is completely counterintuitive. It is not an antidote. It is a bronze serpent lifted up on a pole.
The typology embedded in this historical event is astounding, and the sources unpack it with incredible precision. To understand the mechanism of faith, we have to ask the questions the text raises: why a serpent and why bronze?
Yeah, why use the image of a snake?
The serpent was the very symbol of the curse. It was the instrument of death, the physical manifestation of the deception in Eden, and the literal creature currently killing the Israelites in the camp. Yet, God commands Moses to forge an image of that exact curse.
It seems so backwards.
It does, but the authors link this strange command to the Apostle Paul's words in Romans 8, verse 3, which states that God sent his own son in the likeness of sinful flesh.
Oh, I see.
The bronze snake looked exactly like the venomous snakes that were killing the people, but it possessed no venom.
Just as Christ took on human flesh, living in a cursed world, but possessed no sin.
Yes. The Apostle Paul says he knew no sin, yet he was made to be sin for us. He took on the likeness of the problem without possessing the poison.
And what about the metal? Why bronze?
The choice of metal is equally significant in biblical typology. In the construction of the tabernacle, bronze is the specific metal associated with the fire of divine judgment.
Like the bronze altar.
Exactly. The great altar of burnt offering in the courtyard, where the sacrifices were consumed by fire, was overlaid entirely with bronze. So, a bronze serpent lifted on a pole represents the judgment of the curse, forged in the fire of God's holy wrath, elevated for all to see.
Let's think about the practical reality of this situation for an Israelite living in that camp. It is like someone being bitten by a rattlesnake today.
Yeah, that is a great modern equivalent.
What is the natural human instinct when you are bitten by a venomous snake? You look at the wound, you examine the puncture marks, you want to study the venom, you want to try and suck the poison out, you want to find a medical solution, or you just sit there and panic as you watch your legs swell up.
Your entire focus goes to the injury.
Right. The absolute hardest thing to do in that moment of physical agony is to ignore the lethal wound entirely, turn your back on your own swelling leg, and look away at a piece of metal on a wooden stick.
That captures the psychological difficulty perfectly. The sheer scandalous nature of this grace is what makes it so difficult for human nature to accept.
Because we want to fix it ourselves.
Always. Human beings want to contribute to their own rescue, but the healing in the wilderness did not require a complicated medical procedure. It did not require the bitten Israelite to show moral worthiness before looking.
They didn't have to promise to be better people.
No, they did not have to promise to be better Israelites in the future, or to offer a sacrifice, or to analyze the chemical makeup of the venom in their veins. It required one thing, and one thing only: a simple, desperate look based entirely on a divine promise.
And the text points out heavily that there were no magical medicinal properties in the brass itself. Looking brass does not cure a snake bite.
None at all. The healing flowed exclusively from the promise of God that was attached to the specific act of looking. The power was in the object looked upon, not the subjective intensity of the looker.
Wait, unpack that for a second. The subjective intensity.
Yeah, a person who looked with squinting, tear-filled eyes, trembling in fear that it might not work, was healed just as completely as the person who looked with absolute bold confidence. The requirement was simply to look.
Wow, that is incredibly comforting.
And Jesus applies this directly to himself in John chapter 3. He tells Nicodemus, "As Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, even so must the Son of Man be lifted up."
So Christ on the cross is the bronze serpent.
Yes. Christ on the cross was elevated in public shame, bearing the curse, absorbing the fiery wrath of God. The look of faith is saving because it looks outward to the crucified Christ whom God has appointed as the sole remedy.
If the remedy is simply looking at the bronze serpent, what stops someone from just giving it a casual glance out of the corner of their eye while they keep trying to suck the venom out of their leg? Does the Bible specify how we are supposed to look?
That is the pivotal question.
This specific type of looking is so central to the biblical argument that the authors of these texts dive deep into the specific vocabulary used by the biblical writers. This brings us into the linguistic architecture of the text.
The language here is so precise.
The words chosen by the authors of Hebrews and Numbers are highly specific. We are looking at the Greek word aphorontes in Hebrews 12, verse 2, and the Hebrew word nabat in Numbers 21. Let's break those down.
If we actually look at the original Greek word Paul uses in Hebrews 12, aphorontes, it completely changes the picture. It is a compound verb, which means it joins two separate concepts together to create a stronger meaning.
Okay, what are the two concepts?
It combines the preposition apo, meaning away from, and the verb horao, meaning to see or look intently. So the literal mechanical force of the word is to decisively look away from all other competing objects in order to fix your gaze undividedly upon one primary target.
It's an active decision. It is not just glancing around the room and happening to see something.
Not at all. The author of Hebrews specifically avoided using the common Greek word blepo, which just means casual physical observation the way you might notice a bird flying by or a cloud in the sky.
Right, a passive observation.
Yeah, he chose a word that demands a voluntary, active disengagement of the mind from surrounding distractions. You must turn your head away from one thing to look at another.
And does the Hebrew word in Numbers carry that same weight?
It matches the Hebrew root nabat perfectly in the Numbers account. Nabat does not mean a passing glance. It means an intense, expectant, longing look. It is used repeatedly in the Old Testament, frequently carrying the heavy theological weight of looking to God for sovereign salvation when all other earthly options have failed.
Here's where it gets really interesting. This specific vocabulary completely shuts down other religious frameworks. It requires an active disengagement.
Yes, you have to actively look away.
You have to actively decide to stop looking at the temple rituals, stop looking at your own religious performance, stop looking at your fears, and lock your vision onto this one singular target.
The cognitive difficulty of executing this command today is staggering. We live in an era of multi-screen digital saturation. We are constantly bombarded by notifications, news cycles, and social media algorithms designed to steal our focus.
Our attention is fractured by design.
It really is. The discipline of looking away from everything else to focus entirely on one single reality is becoming a lost human capacity.
Think about an Olympic sprinter lining up for the 100-meter dash. That is the image that comes to mind with this word aphorontes.
Oh, that is a great visual.
When the starting blocks are set, that sprinter has a monumental task ahead of them that is mostly mental. When the starting gun goes off, they have to actively block out the screaming crowd of 80,000 people in the stadium.
They cannot afford to listen to the noise.
Right. They have to block out the competitors running right next to them in their peripheral vision, guys who might be pulling ahead. They even have to block out the burning pain in their own lungs and legs. They have to lock their eyes solely on the finish line.
Because if they look around, they lose.
Exactly. If a sprinter turns their head to check on the runner in lane 4, their body mechanics break down and they lose speed. They have to look away from everything else to look exclusively at the goal.
That athletic imagery is highly intentional. It is what the apostle is using in Hebrews chapter 12. The text transitions directly from this concept of looking into the metaphor of running a very specific, preordained track.
Oh, the running metaphor.
Yeah, the linguistic precision of aphorontes looking away to look at Christ is the prerequisite for the physical command to run the race. You cannot run if you are looking backward or looking at your own feet.
Let's read the setup from Hebrews 12, verse 1, as outlined in our sources. The text states that we are surrounded by a great cloud of witnesses. Because of this, we are commanded to lay aside every weight and the easily ensnaring sin, and to run with endurance the race that is set before us.
There's a lot to pull apart here in terms of how a runner prepares for the track.
The sources make a vital distinction here between two different obstacles, a weight and a sin. Let's talk about the weight first.
Okay, so the Greek word for weight is onkos. The text clarifies that a weight is not necessarily something inherently evil or immoral.
So it's not a sin.
Right. It might be an entirely lawful, permissible thing. It could be a demanding career, a heavy presence on social media, an absorbing hobby, a political affiliation, or even intense ministry labors.
Even ministry labors.
Yes. The issue is not whether the thing is morally evil, but whether it acts as an encumbrance to your specific spiritual progress. If a legitimate earthly blessing becomes so absorbing that it drains your spiritual stamina, slows your forward progress, and diverts your gaze from Christ, it functions as a weight, and the biblical command is to ruthlessly discard it.
That is a hard teaching. You cannot run a marathon carrying a television set. It isn't a sin to own a television, but it will absolutely stop you from running.
It will crush you. You won't make it a mile. But the author goes further. We must also strip off what he calls the besetting sin, or the easily ensnaring sin.
And the sources are very specific about what that sin is.
Yes, they identify the specific clinging sin not as general immorality, but specifically as the sin of unbelief. In the context of Hebrews, unbelief is the specific sin that wraps around the runner's ankles. It tangles the feet.
It trips you up.
You cannot make forward progress on the Christian track if your legs are bound up by a fundamental lack of trust in God's promises. Unbelief causes you to trip over your own feet.
I have a hard time with this passive language in the text regarding the race itself. We are told to run the race that is set before us.
Yeah, that passive phrasing bothers a lot of people.
In our modern culture, we are told that we are the architects of our own destiny. We like to pick our own struggles. We like to curate our challenges so they highlight our strengths. But the text says the race is already marked out.
It is already laid down.
How does realizing that God mapped the specific track, whether that track involves chronic illness, financial poverty, or intense social opposition, change how a runner handles the pain of the race?
It changes the entire paradigm because it removes the illusion of human control and replaces it with rest in divine providence. The texts stress that this race is not a chaotic, self-directed jog through the woods.
It is a structured course.
It is a sovereignly assigned lane. The passive construction set before us indicates that God has bounded the course. You do not design your own trials, and you do not pick your own obstacles. The track was measured and laid out by a sovereign God before you were born.
There is a liberating reality in that, even if it sounds restrictive at first. You do not have to design your own spiritual path. You simply have to run the lane assigned to you.
Exactly.
If you realize God set the track, you do not have to look at the person in the next lane who might have a smooth, flat, prosperous track, while yours is entirely uphill and covered in rocks, and feel envy. You just run your lane without comparing your track to theirs because God designed your specific track to require a specific dependence on Him.
That is the essence of biblical endurance. The Greek word used for endurance here is hypomone, which speaks of steadfastness under immense pressure. It is not passive resignation, it is active, fiery determination to keep moving forward despite the pain.
So it's not just giving up.
No, not at all. Imagine a runner trying to compete in a decathlon while wearing a heavy, soaking wet winter coat, and their shoelaces are tied together.
That sounds miserable.
It might be technically possible to hop forward a few inches at a time, but disaster and exhaustion are inevitable. You have to take off the coat representing the lawful weights, and you have to untangle the laces representing the sin of unbelief. Only then can you run the lane set before you.
Having cleared the track of these personal weights and the tangles of personal unbelief, the sources then take a very sharp turn. They move from individual weights to taking aim at the massive cultural and ideological weights that currently tangle the modern church at large.
Yes, the scope zooms out significantly here.
Before we jump into this next section, I need to give a very quick but necessary heads up to you listening. The authors of these texts pull absolutely no punches here. They take direct aim at some highly charged modern movements and theological systems.
Yeah, everything from critical race theory to Roman Catholicism.
Right. And as your hosts, we are not here to take a side or endorse these specific critiques today. We are strictly, impartially reporting what these essays are arguing. We just want to explain the underlying logic of why the authors believe these movements trap people in a destructive inward or horizontal gaze.
Right. That is our only goal here, tracing their logic.
So keeping that strict impartiality in mind, let's look at how they connect those dots. The authors critique Arminianism, Roman Catholicism, modern mysticism, seeker-sensitive church pragmatism, critical race theory, often called CRT, and evolutionary materialism.
The logical connection the authors make across all these disparate movements is that they all, structurally and necessarily, force the human eye away from the finished work of Christ.
They change the trajectory of the gaze.
Yes, they mandate a gaze that is directed either inward to the self, downward to the earth, or horizontally to other people. Let's start with the sociological claims the texts make. The authors argue that ideologies like CRT structurally force individuals to gaze horizontally.
Explain the mechanics of that. How does that framework force a horizontal look?
The logic outlined in the text is that if your primary lens for the world is based on critical theory, you are required to define yourself and others primarily by group identity, power dynamics, and historical grievances.
So you're always looking side to side at other groups.
Correct. Instead of looking up to a transcendent God who unites believers across ethnic lines in Christ, individuals are forced to look horizontally at fellow human beings to calculate who holds power and who owes a debt.
Which locks you into a constant state of comparison.
The text argues that this framework replaces the finished vertical work of Christ's atonement with a system of perpetual horizontal guilt and grievance that can never achieve actual reconciliation. Your ultimate problem becomes a historical grievance against a fellow human, locking your gaze horizontally on the track and the other runners, rather than looking up to the sovereign who designed the race.
And what about the critique of evolutionary materialism?
The argument there is that a purely materialistic worldview forces a downward gaze. It strips humanity of its dignity as image bearers of God.
Because it says we are just biology.
Right. If humans are nothing more than the product of unguided biological processes, the gaze is directed downward to beastly origins, mere survival, and the grave. There is no transcendent heaven to look toward, only the dirt from which we came and to which we return.
The authors argue that this specific inward and downward focus across our culture is not just philosophically wrong, but is directly responsible for a massive mental health crisis.
The data they provide on this is staggering.
They cite a specific statistic claiming that 63% of young adults from Christian homes suffer from unprecedented anxiety and despair. They attribute this directly to what they call expressive individualism, the cultural demand to look inward to find one's own truth and construct one's own identity.
The psychological collapse is seen by the authors as the inevitable mechanical result of turning the human vision away from the Creator. The human soul was not engineered to bear the weight of creating its own meaning.
We were built to look out, not in.
Yeah, when you are told that you must generate your own truth, your own identity, and your own morality from within, you are being crushed by a weight you were never meant to carry.
That covers the cultural critique. But the text also makes sharp theological attacks within the bounds of Christendom. I want you to clarify the author's logic here regarding their critiques of Arminianism and Roman Catholicism. Why does the text argue that looking at your own free will or your own cooperative works is just another form of fatal inward looking?
The texts view both systems as theological frameworks that force the believer to rely, at least partially, on their own internal resources, which naturally draws the eye inward.
Let's take Arminianism first.
Regarding Arminianism, the authors argue that if grace is resistible and salvation in the end depends on the autonomous free will of fallen man to make the final deciding choice, then the believer's gaze is inevitably turned inward.
Because the deciding factor is inside of them.
Precisely. The individual has to measure the strength and sincerity of their own free will. It makes human choice the decisive factor in salvation. The authors argued this is a fatal inward gaze because human resolve is inherently unstable. If your assurance rests on the strength of your choice, you must constantly stare at your own psychological state to ensure you still mean it.
Oh, wow. I can see how that leads right back to the spiritual paralysis we talked about earlier. And the critique of Roman Catholicism follows a similar logic regarding works.
Yes, very similar. The text asserts that the Catholic system requires the believer's cooperative works and participation in the sacramental system to maintain justification.
So it's not a finished work.
According to the author's critique, no. Therefore, the believer is forced to look inward at their own merit, their own obedience, and their own state of grace to secure their standing before God. The authors argue this destroys the outward gaze of faith because the believer is always checking their own spiritual bank account rather than trusting entirely in the imputed righteousness of Christ.
The texts also call out modern mysticism and seeker-sensitive church pragmatism. These are very common in the modern landscape.
Oh, they are everywhere. The critique of mysticism is that it instructs the believer to look inward for subjective feelings, emotional highs, new signs, or extra-biblical whispers, rather than looking outward to the objective, written word of God.
So the mystic is constantly checking their emotional temperature to see if God is present.
Exactly. And the critique of seeker-sensitive churches is that they turn their eyes away from the offense of the cross and fix them horizontally on worldly entertainment metrics, demographic data, and psychological marketing to draw a crowd.
They're looking at the crowd instead of the cross.
Yeah. In all these specific cases, the authors draw a stark, memorable contrast. Looking inward to your own will, your own works, or your own feelings is like looking into the dark, corrupt tomb of one's own heart. Looking outward to the biblical Christ is looking into the blazing light of the empty tomb.
Moving past these controversies, the text finally pulls the runner's vision upward. We have cleared the track, we have analyzed the weights, and now we look to the ultimate finish line and the final posture of the Savior. This brings us to the second half of Hebrews 12, verse 2, which shows us exactly who you're looking at.
This is where the Christology of the passage reaches its absolute peak. The text unpacks two specific titles given to Jesus in the Greek text, archegos and teleiotes.
What do those mean?
Archegos translates to the initiator, the pioneer, the founder, or the captain. He is the sovereign originator who blazed the trail of faith. He cut the path through the wilderness.
He started the race.
Yes. And teleiotes translates to the perfecter or the finisher. He brings faith to its absolute completion. He is the one who guarantees that those who start the race will cross the finish line.
He is the starting line and the finish line. And the text details how he ran his own race when he was on the earth. It says he endured the cross, despising the shame. I want to talk about what despising the shame actually means in this historical context, because we often read right past that phrase.
To understand despising the shame, we have to remember what the cross was. The cross was the ultimate instrument of Roman political terror.
It was designed to humiliate.
It was specifically designed to strip a human being of all dignity, leaving them naked, in agony, and exposed to the mockery of the public. It was also the ultimate Jewish covenantal curse. The book of Deuteronomy states that cursed is anyone who hangs on a tree.
So it was terrifying physically and spiritually.
Yes. Jesus did not pretend the cross wasn't agonizing. He did not stoically ignore the physical pain or the spiritual horror of bearing the wrath of God.
So if he felt the pain and knew the horror, how did he despise the shame?
Well, to despise something in this context means to assign it zero value. It means to hold it in absolute contempt. He treated the world's mockery, the nakedness, the physical torture, and the intense social isolation as utterly worthless when compared to the joy that was set before him.
And that joy was the glory of obeying his Father and redeeming his people.
Right. He weighed the infinite, eternal joy of salvation against the temporary, horrific shame of the cross, and he counted the shame as a zero on the scale. He looked past the immediate suffering to the objective reality of the coming joy.
And because he finished that work, because he ran that perfect race, the text highlights his final current posture. He is seated at the right hand of the throne of God.
Yeah.
So what does this all mean for the exhausted runner today? If you are running your race and your lungs are burning, what does it mean to look at a seated Savior?
It means the work is finished. You are looking at a king who is already resting in victory.
Because you don't sit down if the job isn't done.
Right. When you see a priest sitting down, it means no more sacrifices are needed. The debt is fully paid. You do not have to generate your own salvation. You just have to run toward the one who already secured it.
This raises a vital point about our future hope, which the second source develops heavily. The essay discusses an eschatological reality known in theology as the beatific vision.
Yes, the beatific vision.
Right now, in our current state, believers look to Christ through the lens of Scripture by faith. We see, as Paul says, through a glass darkly. We do not have physical sight of him. But the texts point out that this current gaze of faith is just training for the physical sight of Christ. The author of the second text explicitly states his belief in a premillennial, pre-tribulational rapture.
Yeah, he brings that in toward the end.
Wait, let's pause there for a second. For listeners who aren't steeped in complex eschatology, what exactly is a pre-tribulational rapture, and why does the author's belief in it completely change how they view the finish line of faith we are discussing?
A pre-tribulational rapture is the theological view that Christ will physically return to remove his church from the earth prior to a 7-year period of global tribulation.
Okay, so a very specific timeline event.
Right. For the author of the essay, this specific theological framework acts as a highly imminent finish line. He views this event as the precise moment when the inward struggling faith of the believer instantly turns into literal physical sight. Regardless of where one lands on the specific timeline of the end times, whether you agree with his pre-tribulational view or hold another position, the core, functional point the text's making remains the same. There is a definitive moment coming in the future when this strenuous exercise of faith will end, and it will be replaced by the literal, physical sight of Jesus Christ. The training will be over.
It is the sheer relief of a marathon runner. Imagine you have been running for 26 miles. Your lungs are burning, your legs are cramping, you are hitting the wall, and you feel like you cannot take another step.
We've all been there spiritually.
And then you turn the final corner of the course, and you see the tape at the finish line, and you see the face of the person waiting for you. You know the agony is only seconds away from being swallowed entirely by joy. The physical sight of the finish line gives you the final burst of energy you need to complete the race.
That is the exact function of looking to the seated Christ. The runner who is weary today will one day rest, because the one they are looking at has already run the race, absorbed the curse, and secured the final victory. Faith is the eye that locks onto that reality until the day faith is no longer needed.
We have covered incredible ground today. If you are listening to this right now and you spent the last week agonizing over whether you really meant it when you repented or whether your faith is strong enough to save you, these authors are looking directly at you. They are arguing that your exhaustion isn't a sign that you need to try harder. It's a symptom that you are staring at the instrument of your faith instead of the object, which is Christ.
We started by looking at faith not as an inward feeling, but as an unself-regarding eye, an eye that operates properly only when it is looking away from itself.
We walk through the historical shadows of the first century, the intense temptation to return to visible rituals under the pressure of Neronian persecution. We examined the wilderness typology of the bronze serpent, where life and healing came from a simple, outward look at the provision of God, rather than an inward examination of the venom.
We analyzed the linguistic architecture of aphorontes, the command to decisively look away from all competing distractions, to lock on to a single target.
We talk about clearing the track of lawful weights and the ensnaring sin of unbelief, untangling our shoelaces so we can run the lane God set before us.
And we reviewed the author's rigorous critiques against modern systems, both cultural and theological, that mechanically force the human gaze inward or horizontally.
And finally, we locked our eyes onto the finished work of the enthroned Christ, the captain and the finisher, who assigned zero value to the shame of the cross and is now seated in absolute victory. It is a massive structural framework for how to live and how to endure the lane you have been assigned. So I want to leave you, the listener, with a final question to mull over as you go about the rest of your day. Take a hard, honest look at your mental dashboard right now. What single object, what specific anxiety, or what cultural metric is holding your primary gaze today? What are you staring at when you wake up in the morning? And if you made the active, conscious decision to decisively look away from it and look to the finished work of Christ, how much lighter would your race become? Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We will catch you next time.